Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And today is Wednesday, so my guest is Krys Copeland. Hello, Krys.
Hi, Reverend Don. Good to see you again.
It's good to see you. And Krys is joining us from the Netherlands, and we're going to talk today about what's new at Corellian Publishing. And we have a couple of new things to talk about, a couple of old things to talk about. And we hope that you are having a lovely week. Remember that you can type your questions or comments into whatever platform you are watching on. They should show up here in our chat room, and we can talk directly. Our last few programs, we've had quite a bit of back and forth, but we're also having some issues with Restream. So hopefully we're going out to all the places we should be going. We are looking at possible options to have a different broadcasting platform because I found, for example, yesterday we apparently did not go out to Corellian TV, which is like one of our main channels, even though we had the listing show up just fine there. And I don't understand why that is. And I mentioned yesterday that Restream has once again changed its own formatting, and yeah, we'll just see what all happens there. But hopefully you can see us just fine today. If so, please say hello. We will say hello back. And then we want to say hello to Antonio Huerta in the chat room. It's good to see you.
Hello,
And
Antonio. Good to see you.
what do we want to talk about that's new from CorellianPublishing.com?
Well, the next book that we'll be releasing is your own book, Reverend Don's book of stones, crystals, and metals.
Yes,
Stones,
indeed.
metals, and crystals, and we've been working through the chapter on mythology and getting that really polished, and the mythology of different stones around the world.
Yeah.
So yeah, I remember as we were just talking about before we came on. You said that you were quite familiar with some of the mythology around different stones uh, from European traditions and things like
Mm.
that, and that this is there's also a lot of others. So it's not just
Yeah.
the European myths that we include in here, but also from around the world.
We're
We try
trying
to
to
make
be
sure
quite
there's a
universal.
variety. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think the most fascinating one for me is from Western Europe is the Philosopher's Stone. So could you just tell us
Yeah.
a little bit about that? And
Absolutely.
yeah.
And we want to say hello to Reverend Michael and to Unique One in the chat room. It's good to see you.
Hi,
So,
Reverend
the
Michael.
Philosopher's Stone
Hello, Unique One.
is part of alchemy. It is an alchemical legend. Contemporary audiences would probably be most familiar with it from Harry Potter, where it is a plot device in the first novel, but it is an actual piece of historical mythology. The character of Nicholas Flamel, who shows up in that novel, is also an actual historical person, as well as a alchemical figure in alchemical mythology. Supposedly, he and his wife had developed a philosopher's stone. And the philosopher's stone is one of those alchemical myths that is presented in very physical terms, but was really meant to be spiritual. And the idea is that you understand that the making of this physical stone, which can do things like grant immortality and generate wealth, are really meant to be to represent spiritual development. And this is the biggest secret to alchemy that so many people, including some people who practice alchemy, totally miss very often, that it was primarily a spiritual system. And the philosopher's stone is described as being created through a special furnace and all kinds of little operations. But none of these is actually meant to be physical. It is a description that's intended to tell you what to do spiritually, but it puts it in physical terms, partly to avoid being accused of heresy at that time, because it was not a time of great religious freedom. So there are all kinds of people who, even at the time, were practicing alchemy in a purely physical sense and missing the spiritual aspect of it. The whole idea of turning lead into gold, for example, which is a related concept, was really about turning the quote lead of everyday life into the gold of spiritual enlightenment. And alchemy, when you look at it as a spiritual system, is a very advanced spiritual system. It has a great deal to say, and it has a great deal of impact on a lot of our modern spirituality that we're not aware of because most people don't realize what alchemy actually was. In the Wiccan religion, I'm certainly not going to say it's identical to alchemical mythology, but it's way closer than most people would ever imagine. And the idea of the divine feminine and the divine masculine and the relationship between them, it's a very alchemical thing. And when we talk about the Philosopher's Stone, this too is what we today would call the great work, which they called it also. And it really has nothing to do with making a physical stone, but people did think that. And they thought that it was possible through these different operations to create a physical stone that would grant immortality. And that's, of course, what you see in Harry Potter, and is the subject of the mythology.
Yeah, and I noticed as we were going through this, there's actually a lot of stories around the world about a magical stone like this. In
Mm-hmm.
particular, I'm thinking of the Mani stone from Hindu and Buddhist
Mm-hmm.
mythology in Asia. It was known as the wish-fulfilling jewel.
Yeah.
And one of the most powerful objects in Hindu and Buddhist mythology. In the Hindu
Mm-hmm.
tradition, the Sintamani was said to be like this radiant gemstone that granted its possessor any desire, whether it's wealth or knowledge or spiritual enlightenment. And it was believed to reside in the hands of the gods, who would gift it
Mm-hmm.
to only the most devout believers. And in Buddhist tradition, quite similarly, it was the Bodhisattva that was often pictured holding this jewel.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it is said that the stone could alleviate all suffering, heal people, bring peace and contentment to anyone who sought its wisdom. So that's quite similar, I think, to what we see with the stories of the Philosopher's Stone in alchemy. It
Mm-hmm.
makes me wonder just how far back these alchemical mythologies go, and if they are in fact tied together by mystics from different parts of time and place, traveling and
Mm-hmm.
meeting with mystics from other areas.
Alchemy goes back at least to the Hellenistic era, and there was certainly communication between all of these cultures at that time. There was considerable trade. One of the interesting finds of recent years is the Buddha statue found in Egypt, be, presumably being reverenced by an Egyptian Buddhist or a transplant from Asia. And certainly the Greco-Roman world and India, and through India, China, did have a lot of contact. And so, yes, these ideas probably do have common roots. One of the things people often don't realize, we talk about chakras a lot in the modern metaphysical world, and they don't realize that chakras were also observed in the Western world at one point. In the Greco-Roman world, it was a big thing. Plato wrote about the chakras, and of course, presumably got them from contact with India, because at that time there was quite a bit of that going on.
Yeah.
There's a famous story of Alexander the Great arranging a conference between Greek philosophers and Indian philosophers, in which the Indian philosophers expressed their bewilderment that Greek philosophers thought they could live in the everyday world and still be philosophers, where the Indian philosophers felt that you had to step back from the world to do that. But, I mean, Alexander was in India. And that's the region of India, not the modern state of India. It's not quite exactly the same thing, but there was a lot of communication between these cultures. Even the famous image of Buddha that people most commonly think of is very strongly influenced by Hellenistic art and by the Gandhara culture, which combined Near Eastern and Greco-Roman aspects to it. So yeah, it's absolutely true that these things bear a similarity, partly because the people were in contact with one another. They were exchanging ideas. And we make a terrible mistake in thinking, we make a terrible mistake anytime we think about purity in a religious system, because there's no such thing. Those people who want to do only exactly pure whatever path don't really understand how these things worked in the ancient world, and that these people were all in communication with one another. They were the ones that we're talking about, and they were exchanging ideas constantly, and you can see it. On occasion, it's written out precisely, but most commonly you see it in the artwork, you see it in the similarity of the ideas. And it's actually a very fascinating subject. It takes us a little farther from stones than I probably should have gone, but when we talk about the origins of modern paganism, modern religion in general, there's nothing pure or straight line about any of it. It is all a mixture of many things, and it has been for pretty much as far back as anyone can say. One of the things that is very fascinating is if you look at pre-Roman European civilization, insofar as we can talk about with any kind of authority the things that they apparently believed, and it's a rather limited amount that we can do that, but they certainly appeared to have been sharing ideas, and it's very hard to make the argument that they didn't. And yet you do hear people make that argument, I think primarily because of holding over ideas from Protestantism, which is all about the idea of purity. But, you know, in the age of Christian nationalism, when those ideas of purity are very important to those people, I think it's very important that we remember that that really is not part of our movement. We have always been a movement of many origins and many influences, all kind of coming together at once. And when we look at the history of the magical use of stones, when we look at the mythology of stones, we can see many examples of that from very far back in time. And it's difficult to make an argument that they were not readily adapting from one another on a regular basis, just as we do now.
And just, you know, since you're not a pagan nationalist of any kind, then you also included, you know, bringing inclusivity into the book, stories from even the big three religions, and talked about the mythology there, because, you know, I guess in paganism view, you can study those and gain wisdom from those in the same way you can from any pagan one. There's some grain of wisdom that can be found in a lot of the stories. One in particular you included, well, two that I came across, was the story of the stones of Gethsemane in the Middle East, the weeping stones that were in the garden where the very shortest Bible verse is Jesus wept. Well, the place where he wept was the Garden of Gethsemane, and he wept tears of blood, according to the legend there. So the stones there soaked up his energy, so to speak. And now Christians who go to visit there, pilgrims who visit there, will take the stones as mementos, believing that they will um, um, give them spiritual comfort and heal their wounds. If that's not magic, I don't know what is. So,
Well, and that's part of the point of including it. And yeah, I
yeah,
would describe myself, if anything, as a pagan universalist,
yeah,
if not a universalist in general.
yeah.
And pointing out that sort of practice, which is a contemporary practice as well as a very ancient one. Well, like you say, if that's not an example of magic, I don't know what is. And it goes to show that um, while there may be a lot of attempt to differentiate between these movements, there's also an awful lot in common. And that may be important in the future.
They'll never be able to fully remove, even if, worst case scenario, pagans experience something like the burning times again, or a Holocaust for pagans. They'll never be able to get rid of our culture because they've ingrained it into their own so fiercely for the last 2,000 years that pagans will still rise up from their own ranks. Even if they, destroyed all of us today, there would still be pagans tomorrow being born, and they would find their path. So,
Well,
I
if you look back historically, it's very rare that a group gets completely destroyed. It's unfortunately not rare that someone tries to destroy a particular group, but it's rare that they actually succeed. Now, sometimes what befalls from that is not expected, and you'll see the groups drastically change in certain ways. One of the more interesting theories about that, for example, has to do with the Zoroastrian religion, which is a very ancient religion, but it also had a period when it was marginalized under Greek and later Roman rule, and then revitalized in the 2nd century AD. And a lot of the things that make it similar to Judeo-Christianity, whether they go back before that point is debatable. Because if you look at Zoroastrianism before then, an argument could be made that it was a much more like other pagan religions of the time, and that in fact some of the more monotheistic aspects are a later addition, brought about by their having been marginalized after the fall of the Persian Empire. And these are things, it's very difficult due to the limited amount of written material from that era to really say with absolute certainty. But so many things are not as people think they were. One of the things that people are often surprised by is both how much more like us they were and how different they were also. One of the things that just came out of Pompeii recently, I heard it on Moon Honey Jewelry, which is a channel I follow. But there's a famous body from Pompeii, which was noted for its rather large golden bracelet. And ever since it was discovered, it was always assumed this was a woman, and she was wearing her beautiful bracelet. But recently they did DNA tests, and no, this was a man. And you can easily read about how at that point in time, Roman men did not wear that kind of jewelry, but there he is, and he's wearing it.
Makes me wonder if he was perhaps trans, and yeah.
he certainly could have been in that era because there's plenty of record of that from that era.
Absolutely.
Um, it was not certainly not universally accepted, but it was quite common, and particularly among the priestesses of Mithras, for example, who were ordinarily trans women, the priestesses of Heracles, of whom the same was also true. And because of their priestly status, they were accorded a certain amount of respect. They were not the only ones. And hello to Bimby in the chat room. It's good to see you.
Hi,
And you
Bimby.
see
Good
it
to see you.
also in the society of the times because, for example, the Emperor Nero had at least one trans wife, whose name escapes me at the moment. But the written history of it is not very flattering, but you have to consider who was writing the history. And it was the more conservative people of the time. But it doesn't seem to have raised any particular eyebrows when it happened. And, but, trans people have always been like this.
Exactly. You read those stupid posts from the Christian nationalists about how transgender was just invented in the last 50 years or so. No, no. It's as old as people itself. So yeah.
Yeah, it really is. And the ways in which it was expressed sometimes had to be kind of force fit into the society of the day. But one of the more famous people that I think we could refer to as trans is the brother of Louis XIV, Monsieur the Duke of Orleans, Philippe, who preferred to live. I don't remember what his female name was, but he married and had children because he had to. But he preferred to live as a woman and saw himself that way. Therefore, I would think that he would count as trans, and that was hundreds of years ago. And he's only one example. He's not even the only example out of the various French royal families.
There's a lot of speculation that even Kurt Cobain was actually what in the trans community is referred to an egg, an unhatched trans person, because of there's so many things about his personal life and even lyrics in his song where he said in one particular song, "I am a woman." So there's a good possibility that a lot of people just didn't have the language necessary to explain who they were.
Well, that's true. And again, some may have felt it and not been able to express it. And we have no way to know about that. But, one of the things I remember continuing down this road as a child, there were a lot of women from the 18th and 19th century who lived their lives as men, who today we would think of as trans men. And at the time, some of the people who are now notorious TERFs, to use that term, were celebrating these women for breaking free of the oppression of the times. But once it's pointed out that they also thought of themselves, in many cases, quite clearly thought of themselves as being male in a female body. Sometimes the same people aren't so happy to hear that, but it's pretty obviously true.
Yeah. It's strange how TERFs will just boil a person down to their body parts and nothing else. It's very confusing to me why they're so obsessed with them.
Well, I think it all has to do with what we base our identities on. But to get into that conversation, we'll far exceed our time.
We'll need a Reverend Dodd's Book of Gender or something like that. That would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, that could be an interesting historical study, couldn't it?
Book of Sexuality, something like that, I think would be quite interesting from the Corellian perspective.
Well, if we look at historical personages, one thing we very quickly find out is that there's nothing we do that they did not. Exactly. There's nothing in our world that wasn't in their world. As far back as there is enough information, to make comments on. And
Reverend
there's a
Michael
certain
in the
point
chat.
beyond. Hmm?
Sorry, Reverend Michael in the chat brought up the myth of Mulan from China, and
Mm-hmm.
and he's quite right that most likely it's not a myth at all. That she may have actually been several different people that
Mm-hmm.
existed at the time that fought and lived and worked as men in that community.
Mm-hmm. And we if we look at most tribal communities, many tribal communities, um, over the centuries, they usually had that the multiple gender options within their culture, and um, it's interesting that you will only read about that in certain history books, and not.
Hawaiians in particular have a four gender system. I learned about this on a flight to Hawaii, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
It was a little documentary that they put up during the flight that talked about the four genders of Hawaiian culture. There's boy boys, boy girls, girls, and girl boys, which I think a lot of people would say, yeah, those are pretty broad categories that they could
Mm-hmm.
find themselves in one or the other. I myself would consider myself a boy girl. I'm not very girly in particular, but I have a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm. So, if we look at this historically, it is a far more varied field than, well, particularly our Christian nationalist friends want to admit.
Mhm.
And not admitting it does not change it. But
Exactly.
at this moment, we need to take a moment for a word from our sponsors. Why? Because we love our sponsors. And here we go.
Ready to unlock the secrets of the universe? Join me, Reverend Don Lewis, for my metaphysical and magic auctions at Gaia Thrift at whatnot.com. Discover fascinating artifacts, mystical crystals, and rare and unusual books that could change your life. Don't miss this chance to bring a little magic into your world. Reverend Don's Metaphysical and Magic Auctions, where the extraordinary can become yours.
And we're back. And thank you to our sponsors, Equinox Learning Hub and Reverend Don's Metaphysical and Magic Auctions. And the next Metaphysical and Magic auction will be this weekend, Saturday at 4, I believe. And you will find that at whatnot.com/Gaia Thrift. And if you don't already belong to Whatnot, you can use our coupon to join. The invite is whatnot.com/invite/Gaia Thrift and receive $15 free to spend. And with that, I see that we've come to the end of our half hour. Do you have any final thoughts, Krys?
Well, if you're interested in purchasing or pre-ordering Reverend Don's Book of Stones, Metals, and Crystals, you can do that at CorellianPublishing.com. In addition, we've just released two other books, Witch Wars, Defense Manual Volume 2, and Laura Enright's book, Court of the Five Tribes, which is our first fantasy fiction novel. So please check that out and support our authors.
Yes, indeed. And thank you for joining us today. I'll be back tomorrow. Krys, thank you.
Thank you.
And Krys will be back next week. And with that, let us end with our prayer as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we ask you to continue to help us as we go forward. We rejoice in this walk we walk together, and knowing you are always with us, still, from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. We thank you for your presence. May you be blessed now and always. And again, I will see you tomorrow.
Blessed be.
Blessed be.